On the Irrawaddy, by G. A. Henty. Chapter 16. Rejoicing. Every day since the siege had begun, the defenders had fired an occasional shot at the stockade, not with any idea of doing any damage, but in order that the assailant should know that they were still in the cavern. That evening, when the hole had got to the proper depth, Stanley, having prepared his fuse, went up with 20 cartridges in his pocket, accompanied by Meinik. The hole was charged and tamped, and the fuse inserted. This took a considerable time. The fuse had been cut so that an inch of it projected outside the hole. The other 8 cartridges were then broken up, and the powder moistened, and a train of some 20 feet long laid from the fuse toward the entrance of the hole. Then a piece of rag was wrapped round one end of the ramrod, and this again was tied to a long rod that had, the night before, been cut by one of the boys, who had slipped out noiselessly from the entrance. The rag had been moistened and rubbed with gunpowder. "Now, Meinik," Stanley said, "everything is ready. The rod is 16 feet long, so that lying down my feet will be just at the edge of the hole, and I shall be able to drop down as soon as I have lighted the train, and bolt. I shall fix a torch a foot or so from the train, then I shall only have to lift the rod to it, light the rag, set fire to the train, and then slide down and bolt. Now, you must go down first." "No, master," Meinik said firmly. "I will light the train. I do not think that there is any danger, but whether there is or not, I shall undertake it. If I am killed, it does not matter; while if you were killed, all would be lost, for if the explosion did not burst the stone, I am sure that we should never be able to get through it, without you to direct us. No, master, if you stay, I stay, and that would only lessen our chances of running down the steps in time." Stanley argued and even ordered, but Meinik was obstinate and, seeing that the faithful Burman was not to be moved, he reluctantly left the matter in his hands, and went downstairs. He moved a short distance along the ledge and waited. The time seemed an age to him, so that he gave an exclamation of delight when Meinik suddenly came into sight, and took his place beside him. "I have lit the train, master. The powder fizzed up, but did not seem to burn very fast." It was indeed another 2 minutes before a deep, muffled roar was heard. There was no further noise, but they heard shouts from the Burmans behind the stockades. "They will be wondering what that sound was," Stanley said, "but they will not be able to tell from what direction it came, for I expect they were pretty nearly all sound asleep. Now, let us go up and see the result." They made their way up the steps, which were now in entire darkness. The curtain still hung in its place, some 10 feet below the obstacle. They lit a torch from the embers in the pan, and then Stanley climbed up into the passage, and hastily crawled along. He gave a cry of satisfaction as he approached the end. The explosion had been completely successful. The end of the block lay on the ground. Whether the whole of it had been blown off or not he could not see, but he felt sure that the greater portion must have split off. It was evident that it would take a considerable amount of time, and would require the strength of several men to get the block out. They therefore descended at once to gladden the hearts of those below, with the news that the way out was now available to them whenever they chose to leave. Harry manifested no surprise whatever at the news. "I made sure that you would succeed, Stanley. After getting me off as you did, and making your own escape, before it seemed to me that you would have gotten hold of the open sesame of Ali Baba, and have only to use the cabalistic words to walk in and out wherever you want to go." "I don't feel by any means so certain of my own powers as you seem to be, Harry, and I can assure you I was very doubtful whether that shot would succeed. I hoped, at any rate, that it would blow a good bit of the stone out, and in that case we could have got the chisels to work again. It was the slanting position of the block that beat us. However, thank goodness the work's done now, and you have only to get a bit stronger and we'll be off." "Oh, I am quite ready to start now, Stanley. I think it's absurd waiting any longer, for there's never any saying what might take place. That Burmese general, who seems to be an obstinate beggar, might take it into his head to place a guard on the top of the hill, and then all your labour will have been thrown away." "That is true enough, Harry, and as I recall, I really don't think that travelling now would be likely to do you any serious harm. I will decide on that tomorrow. At any rate, I will take some men up at once and get that stone out." The task was a difficult one. The block of stone was so nearly the size of the passage that they could not get a rope round behind it, and after trying for 2 hours in vain, they determined that the only course was to push it before them. They soon found, however, that this was impossible, and that a part, at least, of the stone was remaining in its place. Finally they succeeded in pushing a loop in the rope over the top of the block, and then by main force 8 of them pulled it out of the hole, and lowered it onto the top step. By the time that had been done, dawn was approaching, and they therefore returned at once to the chambers below. The men were all much pleased when Stanley told them that they would leave that night. Confident as they felt that the Burmese could not force their way in, a new feeling of nervousness seized them now that the way was open, lest some unforeseen circumstances might occur to prevent their going. The rice that remained was made up into 3 or 4 packages. The meat had long before been finished. Stanley had a discussion with Meinik as to how Harry had best be taken through the passage. He could, they agreed, walk along the ledge, with one before and one behind to steady him, and could then be carried up the steps, in a blanket, by 4 men. He must, of course, be lifted into the passage, and dragged through it to the end. After that it would be easy enough. 6 men could carry him in a blanket until far enough away for them to chop poles, without the sound of the axes being heard by the Burmese. From the time they began their work, every pain had been taken to deaden sounds. The blanket hung across the passage had acted as a muffler to some extent, but a piece of cloth had always been tied over the hammerheads of the axes to prevent the sharp clinking sounds of the blows on the chisels or stone being heard. As soon as it was dark enough for them to pass along the ledge, Meinik went with Stanley to examine the ground. Fortunately, the portion of stone that remained above the level, and prevented the rock from being rolled back, was but small, and they were able to break it up in half an hour with the axes. Then, making their way along without difficulty for another 4 feet, they found themselves standing upright in the depression in the centre of the ruin. Mounting 6 more steps, they were among the bushes that covered the site of the temple. They now carefully cleared away every fragment of stone from the floor of the passage, and, returning, Stanley gave orders for the start to be made. 2 or 3 shots were fired from the lower entrance to show the enemy that they were there and on the watch, and then all went up to Harry's room. He had been dressed for the first time, and was ready for the start. 2 of the strongest of the Burmans went on first. "Now, Harry, you are to put your hands on my shoulders. Meinik will follow close behind you, and will keep his arms round you in case you need help. Of course, we shall go along very slowly." "I don't think that all these precautions are necessary," Harry said. "I am sure that I can walk that distance easily enough. Why, you say the stair is only about 40 feet." "I dare say you could, Harry, but we don't want to run any risks. Your head is not very strong at present, and you might turn giddy, or you might stumble. So, at present, you will have to just do as you are told. Let us start." Harry did not find it as easy as he had expected, getting out through the lower opening, and he was by no means sorry to have the support of Stanley and Meinik as he proceeded along the ledge. They moved very carefully and slowly, and all were greatly relieved when he sat down on a blanket laid on the steps. "Now, lie back, Harry. We shall have no difficulty in getting you up here." 2 Burmans took the upper end of the blanket, Stanley and Meinik the lower, and they were soon at the top of the steps. "You are not very heavy now, Harry, but you are a good deal heavier than you were when we brought you in below. Now, the next is the most difficult part of the work. Once you get through this passage, it will be plain sailing. You see, you will have to be dragged. The place is only 2 feet high, so that it would be impossible to lift you at all. We have made the floor as smooth as we can, but I am afraid that there are a good many projecting corners that will try you a good deal." "It can't be helped, Stanley. Fire away as soon as you like." The rest of the party were now all gathered on the steps below, and Meinik and Stanley, getting up first into the hole, received Harry as the others lifted him, and, with the aid of 2 of the Burmans, laid him on his blanket in the passage. "Now," Stanley said to the 2 men who took the other end of the blanket, "keep it as tight as you can, and when I say lift, we will all lift together, and move him forward a few inches. Do not hurry about it. We have plenty of time before us." They were packed so closely that they had each but only one arm available. Little by little they moved him along, gaining some 6 inches each time. Then all had to move, so as to place themselves for the next effort. However, in 5 or 6 minutes they had him through, and carried him up into the open air. The rest of the party at once joined them, and with 3 of the natives on each side of the blanket, they were soon beyond the circle of ruins, and making at a brisk pace through the forest. After going for a quarter of a mile they stopped, cut some poles for the hammock, and in a short time were on their way again, having placed in it one of the bags of rice as a pillow for Harry. They travelled for some hours, and then halted to cook some rice. All had slept a good deal during the day, so that, after resting for an hour, they proceeded on their way again. They had no fear whatever of pursuit, and the only danger that they could incur was from meeting with a band similar to that which had carried Harry off. When they rigged up the hammock, they had cut wood for torches to protect themselves from tigers. These were thrown away as soon as the daylight broke. At midday they halted again for another hour, and then, continuing their journey, arrived at the village before nightfall. They were received with great joy, the villagers setting up a shout of welcome, the friends of the men and boys being especially exuberant in their joy, for they had become extremely anxious at their long absence. The 2 troopers were still there, and these saluted Stanley with less than the usual stiff formality of the Mohammedan soldier. Stanley himself laughed. "No, I don't look much like a British officer at present," he said, in their language. "Well, has everything been quiet here?" "Yes, Sahib. A sowar brought us orders from the general to remain here, and to send at once if we heard any news of you. We sent off one of the villagers when the man came back to fetch the others, and said that you had good hopes of getting Lieutenant Brooke Sahib out of the hands of the Burmese." "I will write a note," Stanley said. "Get your horses saddled at once. Directly we have made Mr. Brooke comfortable, I will give you the letter." During the time that Stanley had been absent, the houses had been re-erected, and the village had assumed its general appearance. A hut was at once handed over to them, and Harry laid on a bamboo pallet. He had not slept most of the way down. "You see, I was quite right, Stanley. I told you that the journey would be nothing." "Fortunately it has turned out so. Meinik has already killed a chicken, and will make it into broth for you. It will be a change for you after your diet of rice. The cooking was excellent for the first 3 or 4 days, but it fell off sadly. That was one of the reasons why I gave way to your wish to start at once. You have done wonderfully well, but a constant diet of rice is not quite the thing for building up a sick man. Now, I am going to write a few lines to the general, to say that you have got safely down, but will need at least another week before you are able to sit on a horse. Of course, you can be carried on, but I think that the air here is a good deal more healthy and bracing than it is at Prome, and the longer you stay here, the better." Stanley's note was a short one. It merely said that he had succeeded in getting his cousin, and the trooper who was carried off at the same time, from the hands of the Burmese, but that Harry was still very weak, and that if he himself could be spared, he would stay with him at the village for another week or 10 days, at the end of which time he would ride, by easy stages, to Prome. 3 days later the trooper returned with a note from the general. "I congratulate you most heartily on having rescued your cousin," he wrote. "By all means stay where you are until he is quite strong enough. This place is not at all healthy at present, and we shall not be moving forward for at least another 3 weeks." Stanley remained at the village for another fortnight, and at the end of that time Harry had so far recovered that he was quite capable of making a short day's journey on horseback. 2 of the men who had aided in the rescue had gone to Prome, with an order from Stanley on the staff paymaster, for the rewards that had been promised to the villagers and the 2 Burmese soldiers. They returned with the money, and the men were all highly delighted at the result of the expedition. Stanley retained the services of the 2 soldiers as long as he remained in the village. He had no fear whatever of the same band returning that had before visited the village, and he learned that no others had been heard of in the neighbourhood, but at the same time he thought it as well that a man should be on guard night and day at each end of the village. The peasants agreed to watch at one end, while the 2 Burmese soldiers and the troopers took charge of the other end. The bulk of the villagers were engaged in forming a strong stockade round, to defend themselves in case of further attack, and Stanley promised to send them down 20 muskets and a supply of ammunition as soon as he got to Prome. There was real regret on the part of the Burmese when the time came for the party to start. It had been something altogether new to them to have officials among them who paid for everything. These Englishmen had treated them kindly, and were pleased and contented with everything. The money that the 5 men and 2 boys had earned had enriched the village, and had enabled them to more than replace their losses by the recent raid, and if Stanley had accepted all the presents of fruit, fowls, and eggs they would have given him, he would have needed a couple of extra horses to convey them. A strong pony had been purchased for Meinik, and, after taking a hearty leave of the villagers, the party rode off. "I wish we had such a good cook as your man, Stanley," Harry said as they journeyed along at a walk. "I have never tasted better soup than he serves up. I must really get him to teach our mess cook how to make it. Do you know what it is, Harry?" "I have not the least idea. It might be anything. I think that it tasted to me more like stewed eels than anything else." "You are not very far out. It is made of the creatures you turned your nose up at, snakes." "Nonsense, Stanley." "It is, I can assure you. I would not tell you before, because it might have set you against it. That soup you had in the cave was made from snake flesh. The recesses in parts of the caves swarmed with them, and the men laid in quite a store of them before we were besieged. Unfortunately, they would not keep well even in these cool chambers, so we had to fall back on rice. You liked it so much that, though there was no occasion to have gone on with the snake soup, after we got to the village I continued to give it to you, for it is very nourishing." "Well, I am glad you did not tell me at the time, but I must own that it was excellent, and I think that in future I shall have no objection to snake in that form." "They are just as good in other ways," Stanley replied. "The Burmans are no fools, and I consider that snake and lizards are very much better eating than their mutton, which is tasteless stuff at the best." "We still have to have a big settlement when we get back, Stanley. Of course, all those men you paid, and the guards you bribed, are entirely my account, to say nothing of my share of the general expenditure." "Well, the general expenses are practically nothing, Harry. I invited you to come with me, and of course you were my guest. As to the other matter, that also is my business. I would not say so, for I had not plenty of funds, but what with my pay as interpreter, and the year of back pay that I got when the Gazette came out, I have plenty of my income to pay for it, without breaking in upon the amount I told you I had got for those rubies." "I should pay you, Stanley, if you were rolling in money. Not that I should mind taking money from you if I wanted it, but my expenses, since I landed here, have not been anything approaching my pay and allowances. And I have, besides, as I told you, an income of £500 a year of my own. You have risked your life for me, and I am not going to let you pay the piper as well." "All right, if it pleases you. Harry, I am delighted at having been able to save you, and just at present money does not seem an important matter one way or the other. So, if it really would be a satisfaction to you to pay, I will certainly not deprive you of it." Although they only travelled 10 miles the first day, Harry acknowledged that he was as tired as a dog when he dismounted, and was so stiff the next morning that he had to be helped on to his horse. However, this gradually wore off, and on the evening of the 4th day they arrived at Prome. Leaving Harry at his regimental camp, Stanley rode to the headquarters and there dismounted. Meinik had led the second horse after Harry dismounted, and now took them both across to the lines, with the air of a man who has only been away for a few hours. Stanley at once went up to the general. "Welcome back, lad," Sir Archibald said. "You have been longer away than we expected when you started. I am glad indeed that you succeeded in rescuing your cousin, and we are all burning to hear about it. I wrote that note to you in a hurry, for I was on the point of going on a round of inspection of the camp, when your sowar arrived. I intended to question him concerning you on my return, for I had no idea that, after making such a long journey, he would start back at once, but I found that he had ridden straight off, directly the note was handed to him. You must dine with me today, and tell me all the story. I see from the colour of your skin that you have been in disguise again." "Yes, sir. There were materials for dyeing the skin in the village, but nothing that availed to take it off. It is gradually going, and as I shall be now able to get some strong alkali from the doctor, I hope I shall be presentable by tomorrow." "They are honourable marks," the colonel said with a smile. "I don't think any of us would mind being so coloured for a bit, if we had done such good work as you have. But I won't detain you now, for dinner will be ready in half an hour." Stanley hurried to his room, took a bath, donned his mess uniform, and was ready for the time the bugle sounded. 3 or 4 of the staff were, as usual, members of the party. After the meal was over, he was requested to narrate his adventures at full length. The story was necessarily a long one, and when he concluded, all joined the general in hearty commendation for the manner in which he had carried out the adventure. "Your last story was a stirring one, Mr. Brooke," the general said, "but this is even more so. When I received your first note, I thought it next door to madness for you to try to get your cousin, badly wounded as you knew him to be, from the hands of the Burmese. It's not an easy thing to get any man out of prison, but when the man was unable to help himself, it seemed well nigh impossible, and I was greatly afraid that, instead of saving his life, you would lose your own. Of course, the fact that you had successfully traversed the country before was strongly in your favour, but then you were unencumbered, and the two things were therefore not to be compared with each other. I shall, of course, put you in orders tomorrow as having performed a singularly gallant action in rescuing Lieutenant Brooke of the 47th and a sowar from their captivity by the Burmese from the prison in Toungoo. And you have arrived just in time, for after endeavouring to fool us for the past 3 months by negotiations never meant to come to anything, the enemy are now advancing in great force and are within a few miles of the town, so we are likely to have hot work of it. From all accounts, they have got nearly as large an army together as Bandoola had. I don't know whether they have learned anything from his misfortunes, but I am bound to say that the court does not seem to have taken the lesson in the slightest degree to heart, and their arrogance is just as insufferable as it was before a shot was fired." Stanley learnt that there had already been one fight. The enemy were advancing in 3 columns. Their right, consisting of 15,000 men commanded by Pseudo Woon, had crossed the Irrawaddy, and was marching down the other bank, with the apparent objection of recrossing below Prome and cutting the British line of communication. The centre, from 25 to 30,000 strong, commanded by the Ki Wong Gi, was coming down the left bank of the river, accompanied by a great fleet of war boats. The left division, 15,000 strong, led by an old and experienced general, Maha Nimiao, was moving parallel with the others, about 10 miles distant from the centre, but separated from it by a thick and impenetrable forest. A reserve of 10,000 men, commanded by the king's half-brother, occupied a strongly fortified position at Melloon. In addition to these, a large force was gathered near Pegu, and threatened an attack upon Rangoon. On the 10th of November, a fortnight before Stanley's return, 2 brigades of native infantry, under Colonel MacDowell, had marched out to dislodge Maha Nimiao, whose division threatened to turn the British right, and to move round to its rear. The force was divided into 3 columns, one moving directly toward the enemy's position, the others, marching by circuitous routes so arranged as to arrive at the point of attack at the same time, were to attack in flank and rear, while the main body assailed the enemy in front. The Burmese had, however, obtained information from spies of the intended movement, and advancing boldly met the British columns halfway, skirmishing with them hotly in the woods, and threatening an attack by large bodies of horse. The centre drove the Burmese before them, and reaching their stockaded position, Colonel MacDowell, while reconnoitring it, was killed by a ball from a musket, and as the 2 flanking columns did not arrive as expected, the force was compelled to fall back. The retreat was conducted in good order, but the loss was heavy, as the Burmese pressed hotly upon them for several miles. Since this unfortunate affair, the enemy had steadily advanced. Maha Nimiao had moved directly upon Prome, advancing slowly and constantly stockading himself. The centre had also advanced, and was now fortifying some heights above the river, 5 miles away, within sight of Prome. Pseudo Woon was entrenching himself on the opposite bank. All these divisions were working day and night, advancing steadily but slowly, and erecting formidable lines of entrenchments as they went, and it seems to be the intention of the Burmese general to proceed in that manner until the whole of his troop were gathered within a very short distance of the town, and then to rush upon it from all sides. In the morning Stanley went to the lines of the 47th. Harry had, of course, told his story on his arrival, and the tale had circulated generally through the regiment, and as he rode in the men ran out of their huts and cheered him heartily. No less warm a greeting did he receive from the officers, in spite of his protest that they had really been in no great danger or difficulty at any time. "What I specially admire," one of the officers said, laughing, "is that any man should have run all this risk on purpose to prevent himself from coming into an earldom. You had only to leave the matter alone, and there you were, the heir to titles and estates." "I should have been haunted by Harry's ghost," Stanley laughed. "It would have been as bad as Banquo and Macbeth. He would have sat at my table and stood at the head of my bed. No, that would have been a much more serious affair to face than a party of Burmese. The titles and estates would have been too dear at the price." "Well, you behaved like a brick, anyhow," the colonel said, "and there is not a man in the regiment who would not have been proud indeed if he had accomplished such a feat. Half my subalterns were talking at dinner last night of learning the language, so that if the chance fell in their way they might emulate your doings." "It's rather a tough language to master," Stanley replied. "It gave me more trouble than the 4 or 5 Indian languages I speak. I'm afraid the campaign will be over a long time before any of your officers learn to talk Burmese well enough to pass as natives." After the failure of the expedition of the 10th, no further effort had been made against the enemy. Indeed, the troops had been withdrawn from their outlying positions, and there had even been a feint made of embarking stores, as if with the intention of retiring down the river, in hopes of tempting the Burmese to make an attack. The season had now come when operations could again be carried on, and the general was anxious to strike a decisive blow at the enemy, and then to set forward on the march towards Ava. As to the result of the fight, no one entertained the slightest doubt, although the disparity in numbers was very great, for while the Burmese commander had nearly 70,000 men at his disposal, Sir Archibald Campbell had no more than 6,000, of whom about one half were British. It was determined that the main attack should be made on the division of Maha Nimau. This was now some 6 or 7 miles away, and beyond the fact that it was very strongly entrenched in the jungle, no information whatever could be gained, for the most vigilant watch was kept up by them, and all efforts to pass native spies into their lines failed. But it was known that among his division were 8,000 Shans from Upper Burma, and as these men had not hitherto come in contact with us, it was expected that they would fight with more courage and resolution than those who had become acquainted with our power. A large number of princes and nobles were with the force, and great reliance was placed by the Burmese upon 3 young ladies of high rank, who were believed by them to be endowed with supernatural gifts, and to have the power of rendering the missiles of the English innocuous. These young women, dressed in warlike costume, constantly rode among the troops, animating them by their presence and exhorting them to deeds of courage. The English had received vague rumours of the doings of these Burmese Joans of Arc, and thought it probable that the enemy would fight better than usual. On November 30th arrangements were made for attacking the enemy on the following morning. The flotilla were to open a furious cannonade upon their works on both sides of the river. A body of native infantry were to drive in the advance posts of the centre, while the main force was to attack their left in 2 columns, one moving directly against it, while the other was to attack on the right flank, thus preventing the enemy from retreating in the direction of the centre. 4 regiments of native infantry were left in Prome. General Cotton commanded the main attack, and soon after the column moved out from the camp, a tremendous cannonade showed that the flotilla was engaged with the Burmese, on both sides of the river. The column, which was composed of the 41st and 89th Regiments, with 2 battalions of native infantry, proceeded some distance before becoming engaged with the enemy's outposts, as the Burmese had been deceived by the cannonade, and believed that the attack was entirely upon the centre. The troops therefore reached their main position, around 2 native villages, without serious opposition. As they issued from the jungle into the cleared space in front of the stockade, they rapidly formed up under a tremendous fire, and rushed forward to the attack. The old Burmese general, who was too infirm to walk, could be seen, carried from point to point in a litter, cheering on his men, while the 3 Amazons exposed themselves fearlessly to the fire. The latter parties, however, rushed forward unchecked, and, in spite of the opposition of the enemy, scaled the stockade at one point, and won a footing on the rampart of earth behind it. Others pressed after them, and soon a destructive fire was opened upon the crowded mass, pent up between the outer stockade and the next. The Burmese method of forming stockade behind stockade was useful against a foe of no greater dash and energy than themselves, but was absolutely fatal when opposed to English troops, who gave them no time to fall back through the narrow openings in the palings. These were soon blocked by the dying and dead. Some of the Shans, led by their chiefs, fought with desperate courage, but were unable to stand the advance of the British, whose steady volleys, poured in at distances of a few yards, just swept them away. Wounded horses rushing madly about in the throng added to the terrible confusion. Groups of men endeavoured to cut a way through the stockades behind, others strove to climb over. Maha Nimau was killed, while bravely exhorting his men to stand their guard, and one of the heroic Amazons was shot. As soon as the troops reached the spot where she fell, and saw that she was a woman, she was carried into a cottage, and there died a few hours afterwards. Stockade after stockade was carried, until the whole position fell into our hands. In the meantime, the other column, commanded by General Campbell himself, and consisting of the 13th, 38th, 47th, and 87th Regiments, and the 38th Madras Infantry, had moved down onto the other side of the Nawine River, and taken up a position to command the ford there, by which the fugitives from the stockade must cross on their way to join the centre. As the crowd of frightened men issued from the jungle and poured across the ford, the artillery opened upon them with shrapnel, and completed their discomfiture. All thought of joining the centre was abandoned, and, re-entering the jungle, they scattered, and the greater portion of them started for their homes, intent only on avoiding another contest with their foes. Another of the Burmese heroines was killed at the ford. 300 men had been killed at the storming of the stockade, but a far greater loss took place in the retreat, very few of the Shans ever regaining their country, the greater portion perishing from starvation in the great forests through which they travelled in order to escape the Burmese authorities, who would have forced them to rejoin the army. Chapter 17: The Pride of Burma Humbled. As soon as the victory was completed, the troops piled arms and were allowed 2 hours' rest. Then they marched back to the point where General Campbell's division had forded the Narrated River in the morning. From this point a path led toward the enemy's centre. This it was determined to attack at daybreak on the following morning, before the news of the defeat of its left could reach it. The day had been a long and fatiguing one, and it was late before the troops all reached their halting place. A meal was served out, and then all lay down to rest. A messenger was sent to Prome to announce the success that had been gained, and to request the commander of the flotilla to open fire in the morning as soon as the foe was seen to issue from the jungle in front of the Wongee's main position at Napadi. Long before daylight the troops were in motion. General Campbell's division led the way along the narrow track leading toward the river, while General Cotton, who followed, was ordered to break off at any path which led toward the Burmese division, to make his way through the forest, and to attack the stockades directly he reached them. The main division would attack as soon as they heard his guns. After a 2 hours' march, the first division came out on open ground by the riverside, signalled their arrival to the flotilla, and formed up in front of the stockaded heights of Napadi. The position was an extremely strong one. The enemy occupied 3 ranges of hills, rising one behind the other, and each commanding the one in front of it. One flank of those hills was protected by the river, the other by the almost impenetrable forest. The hills were all covered with stockades, and as they moved forward the troops were exposed to so heavy a fire from an enemy entrenched at the edge of the jungle on the right that, before they could advance further, it was necessary to first drive them from this position. 6 companies of the 87th were sent back into the forest, and, making their way through this, came down in the rear of the stockades, speedily clearing them of their defenders, and compelled the advance force of the enemy to join their main body. The troops then moved forward to the foot of the first hill, where 2 strong redoubts had been erected by the enemy. The fleet opened fire, but the column was halted for a time, awaiting the sound of firing that should tell them General Cotton's column was engaged. No sound, however, was heard, for this force had been unable to make its way through the dense forest, and General Campbell at last gave the order for the attack. It was commenced by the 47th and 38th Native Infantry, under Colonel Elvington, who pushed through the jungle and forest until they reached some of the flanking outworks on the hill. These they attacked with such dash and determination that they speedily obtained possession of them, and thus produced a favourable diversion for the main attack. This, consisting of the 13th, 38th, and 87th regiments, advanced steadily without returning a shot to the incessant fire from the enemy's various entrenchments, captured the 2 redoubts at the bottom of the hill, and then pressed upward, carrying position after position at the point of the bayonet, till they arrived at the summit of the first hill. The Burmese fugitives, as they fled to the next line of defence, shook the courage of the troops there, and the British, pushing forward hotly on the rear of the flying crowd, carried work after work, until in the course of an hour the whole position, nearly 3 miles in extent, was entirely in their possession. Between 40 and 50 guns were captured, and the enemy's loss in killed and wounded was very great, while desertion alone the Wongee lost a third of his army. While the attack had been going on, the flotilla had passed the works protecting the river face of the hills, and had captured all the boats and stores, filled with supplies for the use of the Burmese army. Thus 2 of the 3 Burmese divisions had now been completely routed, and there remained only that of Suddawoon on the other side of the river. The troops were allowed 2 days' rest, and on the morning of the 5th a force advanced on board the flotilla. Their passage across the river was covered by the fire of a rocket brigade and a mortar battery, which had on the previous night been established on an island, and they landed at some distance above the enemy's stockades. They then marched round and attacked these in flank and rear, while the batteries and boats of the flotilla cannonaded them in front. The enemy's troops were already disheartened by the defeat that they had seen inflicted upon the Wongee's army, and after a feeble resistance fled to a second line of stockades in the jungle to their rear. The troops, however, pressed so hotly upon them that they were unable to make any effectual opposition there. Numbers fell while endeavouring to pass through the narrow entrances of the work, and the rest fled in terror into the woods. These extensive operations had been carried out with the loss of 6 officers and some 70 or 80 men only. It was known that the enemy had very strongly fortified several positions in and around Meday, and it was determined to push forward at once on the long march of 300 miles to Ava, before the enemy could rally from their defeat and gather for the defence of these positions. On the 9th, the 1st Division, again under General Campbell, himself started from Prome. The roads were extremely bad, and they were able to move but slowly. Their course was first directed inland, as it was intended to turn the enemy's position at Meaday, by following a road several miles from the river, and thus forcing them to fall back as we advanced. On the next day the force reached the spot where Colonel MacDowell had been killed, in the unsuccessful attack upon Maha Nimyau, and it then turned north and followed the road parallel to the river. On the 12th, tremendous rains for some hours converted the road into a morass, and although the march was but 5 miles long, the greater portion of the column failed to reach its destination. This, however, was not the worst. Cholera broke out at once, and carried off a large number of victims, 2 of the British regiments being rendered almost unfit for service by its ravages. On the 14th, the division encamped on dry ground on a ridge of wooden hills, and waited for a couple of days to allow the baggage train to come up. The change greatly benefited the health of the troops, and amusement was afforded by the partridges, jungle fowl, and deer which abounded in the neighbourhood of the camp. Up to this point no single native had been seen. The villages were all destroyed, and the country was completely deserted. On the 16th a strong Burmese fortification was taken, it being unoccupied save by a small picket, which retired on our advance. This had evidently been erected for the purpose of preventing the river fortifications from being turned, and its abandonment proved that the object of the land march had been gained, and that the enemy had abandoned the position they had with so much care prepared for the defence of the river. On the 18th they joined General Cotton's column, and the next day entered Meaday. Here a terrible spectacle was met with. The town and the ground within the stockades was strewn with dead and dying, some from wounds, others from cholera, for the ravages of this plague had been as great among the Burmese as in the British force. A number of men were found crucified on gibbets, doubtless as a punishment for attempting to desert. The air was pestilent, and the force was glad indeed to march on the next day from the locality. They gained something, but not much, from the change. For the next 50 miles dead bodies were met with at very short intervals, and each day before camping many corpses had to be removed before the tents could be fixed. It was now known that the Burmese army, in its retreat, had been concentrated at Melloon, where the reserve of 10,000 men had been posted. On the 27th the division encamped within 4 miles of that town. They had now marched 140 miles from Prome without meeting a single inhabitant of the country, or being enabled to obtain any cattle whatever for the supply of the troops, so effectually had the enemy wasted the country as they retired. Melloon stood on the opposite bank of the Irrawaddy, and letters had arrived from that town, saying that a commissioner had arrived from Ava with full powers from the king to conclude a treaty of peace. Colonel Adair and Stanley accordingly were sent off the next morning to Melloon to arrange for an immediate meeting for the commissioners. However, they could come to no arrangement, the Burmese leaders insisting that so important a business could only be carried on when a favourable day arrived, and that no time could at present be stated. Seeing that the principal object of the Burmese was to gain time, the colonel informed them, through Stanley, that, as no arrangements had been made, the troops would recommence their advance as soon as he returned to the camp, and accordingly the next morning the division moved forward to a town immediately opposite Melloon. That place stood on the face of a sloping bank, and as the Irrawaddy was here about 600 yards broad, a good view was obtained of the fortifications. The principal stockade was in the form of a square about a mile on each face, mounting a considerable number of guns, especially on the side facing the river, and a succession of stockades extended for a mile farther along the banks. The great work was crowded with men. In front of the town lay a large fleet of war boats and larger craft with stores. A short time after the troops reached the spot a great noise of gongs, drums, and other warlike instruments arose on the other side, and crowds of boatmen were seen running down to the vessels. These were soon manned, and oars got out, and they began to row up the river. As, owing to the intricacy of the channel, the steamboat and flotilla had not yet arrived, a few shots were fired at the boats by the field guns. This had the desired effect, many of the boatmen jumping overboard, leaving their craft to drift down the river, while the great bulk hastily turned their vessels about and anchored in their former position. As soon as the steamer with the flotilla came up, 2 war boats pushed off from shore, saluted the steamer, and rowed alongside of her until she and the flotilla were safely anchored above the town. This was so evidently a mark of a real desire for the suspension of hostilities that the 2 officers were again sent across the river. A truce was agreed upon, and an arrangement made for the meeting of the negotiators upon the following day. 4 meetings were held between the 2 commissioners and those appointed by the British general, the meetings taking place on boats moored in the centre of the river. At length the treaty was accepted and signed by the Burmese, and 15 days' truce allowed for the ratification of the treaty by the king. As the end of that period approached, the Burmese protested that they had not yet received an answer, and asked for further time, which was refused, unless on the condition that Melloon was evacuated and the Burmese army fell back until the ratification of the treaty reached them. As had been for some time strongly suspected, the negotiations were simply a device to arrest our advance, and the treaty was afterwards found in the Burmese camp, it never having even been forwarded to Ava. At midnight on the 18th, when the armistice came to a conclusion, troops began throwing up earthworks, the heavy guns were landed from the flotilla, and at 10 o'clock the next morning 28 guns were in position ready to open fire. In spite of remonstrances that had been made, the Burmese had, night after night during the armistice, continued to work surreptitiously at their entrenchments. It was hoped for a moment that when they saw the speed with which our batteries had been thrown up and armed, that they would offer no further resistance. As, however, they were evidently preparing for action, our guns opened fire at 11 o'clock. This was kept up for 2 hours. While it was going on, the troops intended for the assault were embarked on boats some distance up the river, so as to ensure their not being carried by the force of the stream across the face of the Burmese works, and exposed to the concentrated fire of the enemy. They were divided into 4 brigades, the first of which, consisting of the 13th and 38th Regiments, under Lieutenant Colonel Sale, were to land below the stockade and to attack its southwestern angle, while the other 3 brigades were to land above it, to carry some outworks there, and to attack the northern face. A strong northerly wind and the violent current prevented the assaults being made simultaneously. The first brigade was carried too far across, and as it passed the stockade was exposed to the fire of the guns and musketry of the river defences, while the 3 other brigades were unable for some time to reach their intended landing places. Colonel Sale was among those wounded by the Burmese fire, but directly the first brigade reached the shore, they formed up under the partial cover of a shelving bank, and, led by Lieutenant Colonel Frith, moved forward to the assault in admirable order. When within a short distance there was a forward rush, in spite of the storm of shot. The latter party gained the foot of the stockade, and placing the ladders, climbed up and leapt down among the surging crowd of the enemy. Others followed, and soon a firm footing was obtained in the works. Then the men of the 2 regiments, whose total strength did not exceed 500, advanced steadily, drove before them some 10,000 armed men, and expelled them from the works that the Burmese had deemed impregnable. While this was going on, the other 3 brigades had landed above the stockade, and now falling upon the enemy as they poured out from their works, completed their defeat. All the stockades were carried, and the whole of the artillery and stores fell into our possession. 4 days later the army began again its advance. They were met by 4 Englishmen, who had been taken prisoners, and an American who had also been held in confinement. These had been sent to assure the English general that the king was in earnest in his desire for peace. It was but too evident, however, that no confidence could be placed in Burmese negotiations, and it was, moreover, known that another army was being assembled, in the greatest haste, to bar the advance. On the 14th of February, the British reached Pakang Ye, having passed Sengaboon on the opposite shore. This was the first point where the road from Aracan reached the Irrawaddy, and it had been arranged that the force that had been operating in Aracan should, if possible, effect a junction with Sir Archibald Campbell here. A message brought down by a native was, however, received, stating that the force had suffered very severely from fever and cholera, and that the natural obstacles were found to be too great to be overcome by troops debilitated by disease, that the attempt had therefore been abandoned. Fortunately, the English general was well able to do without this addition to his strength. He had already proved that his command was perfectly capable of defeating any Burmese force that could be brought against him, and an addition would only have increased the difficulty of transportation. On the 9th of March, the British force, which, owing to the necessity for leaving strong bodies to hold Melloon and other points that had been captured already, now mustered less than 2,000 fighting men, advanced to attack the enemy, whose numbers were estimated at 16,000. The new commander of the Burmese adopted other tactics than his predecessors. His stockaded position was in front of the town of Pagan, but he occupied the jungle in great force, and attacked our advance guard 5 miles from the town. As the enemy occupied the hills on both sides of the main road, Sir Archibald Campbell divided his force and led half of it through the jungles on the right, while General Cotton led the other half through the woods on the left. The Burmese fought with considerable obstinacy. General Campbell and his staff, with 38 troopers and 50 men of the 13th, were somewhat in advance of the column, when the enemy closed in on both flanks and even got in their rear. These were, however, dispersed by the rest of the 13th, and driving back the Burmese on the flanks, the advance was continued. Presently, however, as the British issued from the jungle, a mass of the enemy's horse charged down, drove back the skirmishers, and for a time the position of the general and his staff was one of great peril. His little body of troops, however, dashed boldly at the assailants, and held them in check, until the guns that had followed the staff were brought forward from the jungle. Then the troops divided and rode right and left, and the guns, opening fire, checked the assailants until the infantry came up. The Burmese army was now seen drawn up in the form of a semicircle in the open. The two British columns were united, and together moved forward to attack the centre of the crescent, disregarding the fire from its wings. When within charging distance, they went forward with a rush, and cheering lustily fell upon the Burmese and broke their centre, thus isolating the two wings. The Burmese at once retreated with the greatest haste to the stockaded position in their rear. As usual, the narrow entrances to the stockades caused great delay, and the British were upon them before they were in any way prepared to resist the assault. Heralding their advance by sweeping volleys, the English fell upon the Burmese with the bayonet, and drove them out of their works. The enemy made an attempt to rally behind the walls and in the pagodas of the town, but the effort was vain. They were driven out with great slaughter, hundreds were drowned in endeavouring to swim the river, and the army was finally dispersed in all directions. The effect of this victory was at once apparent. The country people, who had, on the advance of the British force from Prome, been cleared out from the villages along the whole line of route, being now freed from the restraint of their troops, came flocking back in great numbers, some by the roads and some in boats, and it was evident that they regarded the struggle as definitely terminated. There was, indeed, no possibility of further resistance, as the armies of Burma, raised with immense difficulty and by heavy bounties and the promises of great reward, were hopelessly scattered, and Ava lay open to the British advance. In other directions their position was equally desperate. Aracan had been wholly rescued from the Burmese grasp. A British force in Pegu had marched up the river Sitang, and after the repulse of a party of 150 men, imprudently sent to attack Sitang itself, captured the place after a sharp fight, and receiving reinforcements from Rangoon, continued their way up the river and captured Toungoo, while the northern force had driven the Burmese out of Manipur and had reached the river Ningtai by the 2nd of February, and were in a position to advance direct upon Ava. After a halt of 2 days, General Campbell advanced on the 12th of February. Mr. Price, the American who had been sent down after the capture of Maloon, went forward to Ava with the treaty that had been drawn up before the capture of that place, and the king had no longer any hesitation in complying with its terms, and was indeed delighted to find that the recent victory of the invaders had not increased their demands. He at once sent down to accept them, but as no official ratification was sent, the march continued, while Mr. Price again returned to Ava. When the force was within 4 days' march of the capital, the latter returned with the Burmese commissioners and the other high functionaries, with the ratified treaty, and the first instalment of the money that was to be paid. It was a disappointment to the army that, after their long march and many sufferings, they were not to be allowed to enter the enemy's capital in triumph. Undoubtedly, however, the course taken was the wisest. Ava was regarded as a sacred city, and it was to save it from the humiliation of being occupied by the invaders that the king had brought himself to accept the terms of the treaty. Had the English general insisted upon entering the capital and signing the treaty there, he would have found no one to meet him. The population would have been driven out, the king and court would have retired further up the country, and the war might have continued for an indefinite time. Already its costs had been enormous, exceeding £5,000,000 sterling. During the first 11 months after landing at Rangoon, nearly half of the Europeans died, and from the time they advanced from that town with fresh reinforcements from India to the arrival near Ava, a similarly heavy loss was sustained. 4% of the number engaged was killed in action. The climate of Aracan was still more deadly, as 3/4 of the white troops employed there died, and very few of the survivors were ever fit for service again. The sepoys suffered less in Aracan, losing only 10% of their number, though nearly half the force were in hospital for some time. According to agreement, the Burmese, as soon as the peace was concluded, sent down a large number of boats for the conveyance of the troops down the river. As they descended it, the garrisons left Maloon, and other places were withdrawn. One of the native regiments, with some elephants and guns, left the force at Sembuan, and marched thence to Arakan for the purpose of investigating the country, and proving whether it was practicable for the passage of troops in case another advance upon Ava should ever be necessary. They found the road unexpectedly good, and met with no resistance whatever, except in the passage of some passes over the mountains. At Maloon, Stanley was very glad to meet his cousin again, for the 47th had been left in garrison there. Harry had been down again with a sharp attack of fever, but was now recovering. "So it's all over, Stanley, and your chances of an earldom have nearly slipped through your fingers." "I am glad indeed that it is so," Stanley laughed. "In the first place, because I could only have succeeded to it at your death, and in the second place, because I have no ambition whatever for a title. I am not 19 yet, and should greatly prefer to make my own way, than to find myself with nothing whatever to do except to spend money as it dropped into my lap. Now that everything is settled, and that Arakan has become English, and we have the seaports on the Tenasserim coast, trade will increase tremendously. We may be sure that the Burmese will be only too glad to flock into our provinces, and to live under a fair rule, to escape the tyranny of their own officials, and my uncle is just the man to take advantage of the new openings. I don't say that I want to live out here all my life. At any rate, I hope by the time I am 30 to be able to come home for a year's holiday, and it's just possible that by then we may have grown into such a large firm that we may establish headquarters in London, instead of getting all our goods from Calcutta. There is certainly to be a very big trade here. In teak alone, the price in Pegu is a great deal below that in India, and if we had a house in London, we should avoid having to pay commissions, and perhaps get better prices for our wood. Of course, my uncle may by that time think of retiring himself, and in that case I might have to stay somewhat longer out here. But I know that he likes the climate, and I have heard him say that, as he has very few acquaintances in England, he thinks that he should prefer a life in Calcutta to one in London." "I should not wonder if I go home very shortly," Harry said. "My last letter told me that my uncle was in failing health, and that he would like to have me at home with him. If the next letter confirms that, I am afraid that I shall have to either resign my commission or exchange into a regiment at home. Of course, at his death I should have to leave the army anyhow. It would be ridiculous for a subaltern to be an earl. Besides, there are things one would have to do. I suppose there are estates to be looked after, and all sorts of nuisances. Anyhow, I shall always be glad I have had my share in this expedition. I have learnt what campaigning is, and I must say that, under such circumstances as we have gone through, it is not quite so pleasurable as I had expected. Half one's friends are dead or invalided home, and one never knows, when one wakes up in the morning, whether one may not be down with cholera before night. The fighting's all well enough, but after all, that takes up but a very small portion of one's time, and marching, and I may say living generally, in this hot sweltering climate with its 6 months of rain, is not enviable work. However, I have gone through one regular campaign, and that's as severe a one as British troops have ever performed, and above all, old man, I have met you, and we have come to be great friends, and I have learned what one fellow will do for another." "I am sure I am very glad to have gone through it, too. I have been fortunate, indeed, in never having been laid up for a single day, and there is no doubt that having served on the staff will be of great advantage to me, even as a trader. I own that I should like to have retired a captain. Of course, promotion has been tremendously fast, owing to the death vacancies, but I have still 2 lieutenants over me." "Oh, you're sure to get the step, Stanley. You've been in general orders twice, besides that notice you got from my rescue. Also, the doctors say that a number of the men who have been sent down to the coast are not likely to live many weeks, and as 5 of your seniors have been invalided, you may get your step, in the natural course of things, at any moment. If I were you, I should ask for 3 months' leave before rejoining your regiment. There will be no difficulty about that, after you have been upwards of 2 years in constant work, and the general will certainly not refuse. Before the end of that time, you will have seen your uncle and talked matters over. Then, if you choose to resign your commission, you can of course do so, but as you are pretty sure to get your step, by death, before the end of the 3 months, and as the general's despatches strongly recommended your service, you may get your brevet majority before your resignation reaches England. A man who has been mentioned 2 or 3 times in despatches, and is specially recommended for honours, is sure to get his brevet majority directly he gets his company." On reaching Rangoon, Stanley learned that 2 of the invalids had died, either on the way down or before they could be put aboard a ship, and that one of the majors, who had been sent to India for change 4 months before, had also succumbed, so that he had already obtained his company, a promotion which would have been at any other time extraordinary, but which in a campaign where half those engaged were carried off was nothing remarkable. Being still on the headquarters staff, he embarked with Sir Archibald Campbell. "You still hold firm to your determination to leave the service, Captain Brooke?" the general said in the course of the passage to Calcutta. "Yes, sir. I am sure that is the best for me." "Oh, I think it is, Brooke. Of course, you have been exceptionally fortunate in getting such rapid promotion. Still, a good business is a great deal better than soldiering. I wrote very strongly in your favour when I sent off my despatches the day we came down to the coast, and you are certain of your brevet. Still, it is just as well that the news of your resignation should not get home before the Gazette comes out with your name in it. I think the best thing that I can do is to give you leave for a time, as soon as we get to Calcutta. I am sure that you deserve a rest, for your work has been terribly heavy." "Thank you, sir. That was just the favour that I was going to ask you. I shall find out, as soon as I get there, where my uncle is, and join him. My own mind is quite made up, but he has certainly a right to be consulted before I take any final step." "Quite right. I feel no doubt that his opinion will agree with yours, and I think that you are showing a good deal more wisdom than most fellows would do, to give up the service when you have distinguished yourself, and have a much better chance than falls to the lot of one man in 100. Still, there can be no real doubt that a man in a good business out here can retire early and go home with a fortune, while in the army you are liable at any time, after you get the rank of colonel, to be laid on the shelf for years. Besides, you will be your own master, which is more than anyone in the army can say. You can go home when you like, either for a stay or for a permanency, and you are not liable to have to run the risk of another campaign, such as this has been." "If one was sure of campaigns, I don't think that I could possibly bring myself to leave the service, but it is the probability of being kept for 3 or 4 years at a time, doing nothing at Calcutta or Madras, that decided me." The general nodded. "You are quite right, Brooke. On active service a soldier's life is indeed a stirring one, but there is nothing more dull and monotonous than garrison life in peacetime." Accordingly, as soon as they landed in Calcutta, Stanley was put in orders for absence on leave for 3 months. He learned from his uncle's agent that they had heard from the uncle only a few days before at Chittagong, and that he was then on the point of leaving for Aracan, whither he had ordered a large consignment of goods to be forwarded to him by the next ship. 3 days later Stanley started to join him, leaving his address at Aracan with Sir Archibald Campbell, in case there should be a need to recall him before the 3 months' leave expired. The vessel in which he was sailing carried the consignment of goods to his uncle, and he had therefore no fear of finding that the latter had left Aracan before his arrival. Meinik was still with him. He left the army after the last battle had been fought, and had travelled to the spot where he had buried his money before embarking with Stanley in the canoe, and after an absence of 3 days rejoined the force. On the way down to Rangoon, Stanley had a long talk with him as to his future plans. "I have only one plan, master, and that is to stay with you as long as I live." "But you will have plenty to live comfortably upon now, Meinik, for after all that you have done for me, of course I shall arrange for you to have a sum that will keep you in comfort." Meinik shook his head. "Burma is a bad country, master. After living with the English, I would not go back to live under the king's officers, in any case. Any money that I have would be squeezed out of me before long. No, master, I will go with you, unless you drive me from you; and if you do, I will go to Chittagong and live there, but I do not think that you will do that." "Certainly not, Meinik. As long as you are willing to remain with me, I shall be very glad, indeed, to have you with me. But if, at any time, you wish to marry and settle down on land of your own, I shall give you 500 pounds, which is only a small portion of the sum those rubies, which you got your band to give me, brought me in." "Oh, I dare say I shall marry," Meinik said, "but that will make no difference. As long as I live, I will stay with you." Meinik had been astounded at Calcutta, which presented a strong contrast indeed to the city which, as a Burman, he had regarded as the most important place in the world. "The Burmese are fools, master. They should have sent 2 or 3 men here, before they made up their minds to go to war. If they had been truly told what Calcutta was like, they would never have ventured to make war with the English." Chapter 18. In Business Again. When the vessel arrived at the mouth of the Aracan River, a canoe was seen coming out from Akia, a town situated at the entrance to the principal of the several channels by which the river makes its way, through a number of sandbanks and islands, into the sea. As it approached, Stanley recognized his uncle sitting in the stern. "Well, uncle, how are you?" he called out, as the boat approached the side. "What, is it you, Stanley? Well, I am glad indeed to see you. I have watched the papers anxiously to see if your name appeared among those who have been killed or have died. Not seeing it, I hoped that you were all right. Of course, we heard from the Madras regiment that came across from Semboing that it was all over, and that all the troops would be shipped off as soon as they went down to Rangoon. But I have not seen any papers lately, and so have not had a chance of learning any news of you. I fancied, though, that you would be back at Calcutta by this time, and thought that I might get a letter from you by this ship." By the time he was on deck, and after a hearty shaking of hands, Stanley asked what he was doing here. "I did not expect to see you until we got to Aracan." "I've been up there, lad. It's a decaying old place, and the stream is in many places shallow, so that it would be very difficult to take up a ship of any size. I foresee, therefore, that this is going to be the chief port of the province. Timber will be floated down here, and rice brought up in native boats, so I shall make my headquarters here, as far as this district is concerned, and put Johnson in charge. I doubt whether, for a time, we shall do as much trade as we shall higher up the coast, but everyone expects a great Burmese immigration, and a large trade is likely to spring up, in time. I have not quite determined on my next move, and it's not improbable that I shall go down in this ship and establish myself for a time at Martaban, and open a trade in the Tenasserim. If I decide on that, I shall only get on shore a portion of my goods, and take the rest on with me there. Now, what are you going to do, Stanley?" "Just what you think best, uncle. I should have thought that, as I speak the language, it would be better for me to go on to Martaban, and for you to work Chittagong and the district up to Assam." "Then you are going to stay with me, lad? Ah!" his uncle exclaimed in a tone of much satisfaction. "I was afraid that you would have got so fond of soldiering that you would have thrown this over altogether." "Not a bit of it, uncle. I am on 3 months' leave at present, and at the end of that time I shall resign. You know I am a captain now, that is to say, I have got my rank by death vacancies, though until the Gazette comes out from England I can hardly be said to be a pukka captain. And what is more, the general himself assured me that, after being mentioned in dispatches 2 or 3 times, and at his strong recommendation of my services, I was sure of the brevet rank of major." His uncle took off his hat gravely. "I must apologize to you," he said, "for addressing you as lad. I had no idea that you were a full-grown captain, still less that you might soon be a major." "I don't care a snap for the title, uncle," Stanley said, laughing, "except that it may be an advantage to me in places where there are garrisons, and indeed generally where there are white officials." "A very great advantage, Stanley. Well, lad, I have been coining money since I saw you at Rangoon. I have been sending a consignment of bullocks down there every week, and have done almost as much with the Manipur force. I have also got the contract regularly now for the supply of the troops at Calcutta. Other trade has, of course, been at a standstill. Now that everything has quieted down, though, there will be a perfect rush, and I have been sorely troubled in my mind whether it would be best to stay up here and take advantage of it, or to be one of the first to open trade at these new ports. Of course, if you are ready to take Martaban, that will decide me. I shall take passage in the first ship going up to Chittagong. My own boat and the dhow are both there, and I shall at once work up all the rivers and set things going again. I have a capital fellow, a native, who is carrying on the cattle business for me, and at Chittagong I shall try to get hold of 3 or 4 more trustworthy fellows to take charge of depots. I see a big future for us, and that before long. I did well with those gems of yours. They fetched £3,500, which I used, besides what you handed over to me. There was no buying up the cattle without cash, and I generally have to wait 2 months after they're shipped before I get paid. Ready money was invaluable, and indeed I could not have gone into the thing on anything like the same scale if it had not been for your money. The Calcutta people would have helped me to a certain point, but they would never have ventured upon such advances as I required. Your £5,000 has doubled itself since I met you at Rangoon. I calculate that our stores at the different depots are now worth about £4,000, so that at the present moment the firm of Pearson & Brooke have at their command a capital of £14,000. A portion of the cargo was landed at Akyah. Stanley went down with the rest to Martaban, and his uncle sailed for Chittagong. A few months later a store was opened at Rangoon. A Parsee storekeepers were sent from Calcutta by Tom Pearson, and these were placed in control of the stores there, and at Martaban, Stanley being in charge of these 2 stations, and Akia, and having a native craft of his own, and a boat for river work similar to that of his uncle. A year later he received a letter from Harry, saying that his uncle had died a month after his return to England, and that he was now established as one of the pillars of the state. "As I went through London on my arrival," he said, "I looked up your mother at the address you gave me at Dulwich. I found her very well and very comfortable. She was full of your praises, and as I was equally so, your ears ought to have tingled while we were together. Of course they wanted to hear all about you, and most of it was new to them, for you had said nothing of your adventure with that leopard, and only a few lines about the rescue of your humble servant, though you had told them that I stood in your way of the earldom. Your mother said that she was prouder of you than if you were an earl, only that she would have liked to have you at home. I told her that you and your uncle were shaking the pagoda tree, and that you'd come home as yellow as a guinea and as rich as a nabob in the course of a few years. Your sisters are older than I expected to find them. Of course you always spoke of them as when you saw them last. They're both growing into very pretty girls, the elder especially. I made your mother promise to bring them down to stay with me for a bit when I came into the title, which I knew could not be long, for I had called that morning on my uncle's solicitors, and they told me that he was not expected to live many weeks. As it is only a month since he died, I suppose I ought not to have visitors just yet, but in a few weeks I shall go up to town and bring them down with me. I cannot help thinking that it's being a little selfish, for when they see this place they would not be human if they did not feel that it would have been yours if you had not been for your getting me out of the hands of these Burmese. I see that you're gazetted captain this week. I suppose long before this you've settled down to your old work of going up sluggish breams and trying to stir up the equally sluggish native to a sense of the advantages of British goods. At present I'm quite content to do nothing particular, to ride and drive about, returning calls and so on, but I expect before long I shall get restless and want to be doing something. However, there is the Continent open to one, and decent hotels to stop at. No fevers there, and no Burmese brigands." A month later he had a letter from his mother, which had been written before that of Harry, but had been sent to Calcutta and thence to Akia, and had there lain until his return 2 months later from a boat journey up to Pegu. She said how kind it was of his cousin to come in and to give them news of him the very day he arrived in London. "Of course we are delighted with all that he told us about you, but it made us anxious to think of your running into so many dangers. We like him very much. We could not help laughing because he seemed quite concerned that you should not have the peerage instead of him. He seems likely to come into it soon, for he tells us that the Earl is very ill. He says that we must come down and pay him a visit as soon as he is master there, but I don't know whether that can be. Of course it would be a nice change, and I believe that it is a very fine place. I said that it would seem strange our going there being no ladies, and that bachelors did not generally entertain, but he said that in the first place he should have his sisters there, who are about the same age as my girls, and that as we were his nearest relations, and you were at present his heir, it would be quite the right and proper thing for us to come down. He seemed quite in earnest about it, and I should not be surprised if we go." 3 months later Stanley heard that the visit had been paid, and that they had stayed a fortnight there. "It feels quite funny settling down here again after being in that big house with all those servants and grandeur. Not that there's any grandeur about Harry. He insists, being relations, that we shall call him by his Christian name. Everything was delightful. Every afternoon we used to go driving, and of a morning he generally rode with the girls. He had a very pretty, gentle horse for Agnes, and a grey pony, a beauty, for Kate. I have a strong suspicion that he had bought them both on purpose. I should not be surprised, but I won't say anything about it." Stanley puzzled over this sentence, which was followed by, "His sisters are very nice girls." "It is evidently something about Harry," Stanley said to himself. "Possibly she has taken the idea into her head that he may fall in love with Agnes. That certainly would be a very nice thing, but I don't suppose it has anything more than an idea of mother's." However, 4 months later he received a letter from Harry announcing his engagement. "I told your mother that she must let me write by the mail before she did, as it was only right that I should have the pleasure of telling you the news myself. It is splendid, old man. Upon my word, I don't know which I ought to feel more grateful to you for saving my life, or for getting me to know your sister. It seems to me a regular dispensation of Providence. You did everything you could to prevent yourself from coming into a title, and now your sister is going to take it, and me. It's quite right that we should come to be brothers-in-law, for we are quite like brothers already. We are to be married in the spring. How I wish you could be with us. Your absence will be the only thing wanting to make everything perfect. I do hope you don't mean to stay grilling out there many years. It seems to me monstrous that I should be having estates and a big income and all that sort of thing when I have done nothing to deserve it, and that you should be toiling in that beastly climate. If I thought that there was the least chance of your rushing home when you get this letter, I declare that I would put off the marriage for a month or so that you should be here in time. But as I feel sure that you won't do anything of the sort, it will be of no use for me to make such a noble sacrifice." Stanley had received the news that he was gazetted brevet major a month after he was promoted to the rank of captain, and 2 months before his name appeared as having retired from the army. He derived, as he expected, much benefit from his connection with the army in his position, as his 3 receiving ports, as it placed him on a very pleasant footing with the military and civil officials, and it rendered his occasional visits to Calcutta and Madras exceedingly pleasant, for in both towns he found many officers whose acquaintance he had made during the expedition. He was always made an honorary member of the messes and clubs during his stays there. The business grew rapidly. The work of the earlier years had so paved the way for larger operations that they were able to more than hold their own against other traders who, after the troubles were at an end, sought to establish themselves at various points on the western coast of the peninsula, and after 6 more years of hard and continuous work, the business came to be a very large and important one. "I think it more than probable," Stanley wrote to his mother, "that before very long I shall be returning home. My uncle spoke about it the last time that I saw him, and said that we were outgrowing Calcutta and ought to establish ourselves in London. We can hold on a bit longer," he said, "but we must come to that sooner or later, and when it does you must be the one to go to England and take charge. I may go home before that for a few months, but I have no wish or desire to stop there. We have now got a good staff, and I shall probably fix myself permanently at Calcutta." 2 years later Tom Pearson, on his return from England, brought back a wife with him and established himself at Calcutta. Stanley joined him there 3 weeks after his return. They had a long talk together that evening. "I see, Stanley," his uncle said, "that things have gone on improving since I have been away, and that our turnover last year was £150,000, and the profits close upon £15,000. I think now that it's high time we opened a place in London. We've almost a monopoly of the teak trade in Burma, and it would be much more advantageous for us to make our purchases in England instead of here. We should save in carriage and in transshipment, besides the profits that the people here make out of their sales to us. I've made a great many inquiries at home as to the prices for cash in Manchester and Birmingham, and find that we should get goods there some 15% cheaper than we pay at Calcutta, even after putting on the freights. So you see it's an important matter. Besides, there would be a better choice of goods, and you know exactly the sort of thing that we require, and the quantities that we can get rid of, and would be able therefore to send consignments each month without waiting for advices from me. And so we should get the things just as readily as we do now from here. I'll give you the names of some of the firms that I have visited, and with whom I have already paved the way for opening extensive transactions. During the 18 months that I have been away, you have learned all about the banking business, and you'll find no more difficulty in managing in London than here. Your brother-in-law Netherley went with me to the Bank of England and introduced me to one of the directors. I told him we intended to open a house in London, and that as soon as we did so we should open an account with them by paying in £30,000, and that we should of course require some facilities, but probably not to a large extent, as our payments for teak there would require a balance of our exports from England, and that I reckoned our trade to be as a minimum £50,000 each way. The matter was made extremely easily by Netherley, saying to my astonishment, "You can let them draw what they like, Mr. Townshend, for I shall give my personal guarantee up to £50,000. I remonstrated, but he would not hear anything said. "Ridiculous!" he exclaimed. "Stanley is my brother-in-law. He risked his life for me, and you don't suppose I should mind risking £50,000 for him. Not," he went on, turning to the director, "that there's any risk in the matter. I know all about the business they do in India, and that there's not a shadow of risk in it. I know that my guarantee will be a mere form, but as it may put them on a better footing with you, to begin with, I shall be very pleased to do it. Of course, we know that there will be no risk in it. The greater portion of our business is a ready money one, and although of late we have been dealing more with native local firms instead of selling direct from our own stores, the amounts are never large, and so far we have never lost a penny. Of course, I shall let you know by every mail how things are going on at all our depots, and you will then be able to form an estimate as to the amount of goods you will have to dispatch to each, sending them direct, of course, if there happens to be a ship going. But all these things, of course, we shall go into at length before you start for England. Did you get down to Harry's place?" "Yes, I stopped there a week. Your sister seems perfectly happy, and plays the part of queen of the county admirably. The 4 youngsters are jolly little things. As to your mother, you will find very little change in her. I really don't think that she looks a day older than when we saw her off at Calcutta. Something like 10 years ago. Of course, then she was cut up with her loss, but quiet and comfort have agreed with her, and the climate is a good deal less trying than it is out here. At any rate, I should not take her for a day over 40, and she is something like 5 years older than that." 3 months later Stanley sailed for England. There was the same argument between him and Meinik that there had been when Stanley first left Rangoon, but this time it terminated differently. "You would be out of your element in England, Meinik. Of course, my life there will be very different from what it is here. I shall go away from home to business every morning, and not get back until perhaps 7 o'clock in the evening. As a consequence, there would be nothing for you to do for me, and we should see very little of each other. You know, I should like to have you with me, and would do all that I could to make you comfortable, but I am sure that you would not like the life. Here you have always been on the move, and there is always something for you to do and think of. I have spoken to my uncle about you, and he will be glad to appoint you to the position of purchaser for our house of teak and other native products in these provinces. Besides being a buyer, you would go up the country and see to the felling and getting of the timber down to the coast, as you have often done before. He knows how absolutely I trust you, and how much you have done for me, and he says that he should be very glad to have you in charge of the buying side of the work here. Besides, you know you have now a wife and children, and even if you could make yourself comfortable in England, they would never be able to do so, and the bitter cold that we sometimes have in winter would try them terribly, and might even carry them off." To these arguments Meinik had reluctantly yielded. He was somewhat proud of the position that he occupied as one of some authority in the establishment of the principal merchants of the coast. He was fond of his wife and little children, and felt that they be established among strangers of different habits and race would be very terrible for them. Stanley bought him a nice house at Rangoon, and as his rate of pay, which had been gradually increased, was now sufficient to cause him to rank high among the native population, he himself came to feel that he had done wisely in accepting Stanley's advice. The voyage to England was an uneventful one, and to Stanley, after the active life he had had for 10 years, the 5 months spent at sea seemed almost interminable. "I should not have known you in the least," his mother said after the first joyful greetings were over. "How much you have gone through since we parted at Calcutta." "Yeah, I had a pretty rough time of it for 2 years, Mother, during the war, but with that exception my life's been a very pleasant one, and I've had nothing whatever to grumble about. This is a pretty house you have chosen, Mother, and the garden is charming. How I have longed sometimes for the sight of an English garden. Of course I have never seen one before, but I have heard you talk of them, and thought how delightful the green grass must be. Of course we had flowers in Burma, plenty of them, and shrubs, but it was not green like this. It is charming." "Yes, it is a pretty house, Stanley. We moved in here 5 years ago, thanks to you, dear boy, and it has been a very quiet, happy time. We have a good many friends now among our neighbours, and have quite as much society as I care for. I suppose you have not yet decided whether you will live here with us," she said, a little anxiously, "or set up an establishment of your own." "Well, of course I shall stay here, Mother. I have never thought of anything else. I see that you have some stables. I shall get a couple of horses and drive into town in the mornings. I have got out of the way of walking altogether. And where is Kate?" "Oh, you will see her presently. She will be here at dinner with Agnes and Harry. I sent her off because I wanted to have you all to myself for the first hour. The others came up to town 3 days ago, on purpose to be here when you arrived. Of course we heard that your ship called at Plymouth. We had been looking for her, for your last letter told us the name of the vessel that you were coming by. So I wrote to them, and they came up at once. They wanted us to go and dine with them, but I would not hear of it. I was sure that you would much rather dine quietly here than in state at Portman Square, with 3 or 4 footmen behind our chairs." "Ever so much better, Mother. I suppose I shall hardly know Agnes, but Harry cannot have altered much. Besides, I have seen him 4 years later than her." Harry's greeting was of the heartiest kind. Stanley's sisters felt at first a little strange with this brother of whom they had but a faint remembrance. "It does not seem to me, Harry, that your dignities have tamed you down much." "No, indeed," Harry laughed. "I find it sometimes very difficult to act up to my position. I never quite feel that I am an earl, except on the rare occasions when I go to the House of Lords, which I only do when my vote is wanted on an important division. The gloom of that place is enough to sober anyone. I can assure you that when I heard of the fire I felt absolutely pleased. Of course they will build another one, perhaps grander than the last, and just as gloomy, but thank goodness it must be years before it can be finished, and until then we shall have to put up with temporary premises. And your chances for an earl are getting more and more remote, Stanley. There are 3 boys barring the way already. I had proposed to myself not to marry, in which case you or a son of yours would have followed me, but your sisters over-persuaded me." Agnes tossed her head as she said, "At any rate, Harry, if you made that resolution it was not worth much, as you gave it up at the first opportunity. I was the first girl you met when you arrived in England, and I doubt whether you had seen another before we came down to stay at Netherley. I had not been there 2 days before you began to make love to me." The temptation would excuse anything, my dear," Harry laughed. "Besides, you see, I saw at once that it was but fair and right to Stanley that, if he could not get the peerage himself, that he might some day have the satisfaction of being uncle to an earl. And so, are you home for good, old boy?" "Yes, and just at present I feel very much at sea as to how to get to work, as Tom Pearson arranged nothing except as to the banking account. Everything else he has left to me. I know nothing of London, and have no idea of the situation where I should look for offices." "Oh, I'll put you up to all that, Stanley. I don't know anything about it myself, as you may suppose, but if you'll go with me to my solicitors tomorrow they will be able to tell you. But I do know that Leadenhall Street is the centre of the Indian trade, and it's somewhere about there that you will probably have to fix yourself. Of course, when you have taken a place you will have to get hold of some clerks. If you put an advertisement in the paper you will get any number of applicants, or possibly my men may, through their connection with merchants, be able to hear of some to suit you. Anyhow, I am sure that you will find no difficulty." Thanks to Harry's introductions, Stanley was established in a handsome suite of offices, with 3 clerks, with much greater ease than he had anticipated. Being thoroughly versed in business, he was not long before he was at home in his new life. 3 years after his return he married Harry's youngest sister. The firm flourished greatly, and became one of the leading houses in the East Indian trade. At the age of 60 Stanley retired from business with a large fortune. He could do this comfortably, as his eldest son and a nephew had become active partners in the firm. He still lives, at the age of 86, in a noble mansion near Staines, and retains all the faculties, even at advanced age.